Summer, 1943. A time when the skies over the heart of Germany burned. Imagine this. You're thousands of feet in the air, the cold biting through your flight suit, the roar of 4 massive engines. A constant companion. You're deep inside enemy territory, a tiny speck in a vast, hostile sky. This was the reality for the crews of the Allied bomber fleets. Their mission: to cripple the German war machine through daylight precision bombing. It was a bold, audacious strategy, built on the belief that American bombers, bristling with machine guns, could defend themselves and strike with surgical accuracy. But the dream was turning into a nightmare. The German Luftwaffe, far from being defeated, rose to meet them with ferocious determination. Swarms of Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, like angry hornets, tore into the bomber formations. These were some of the most advanced fighter planes in the world. Piloted by seasoned veterans, they attacked with a terrifying new efficiency, flying head-on into the bombers. Cannons blazing, turning the tight formations into scenes of unimaginable chaos. For the young men inside those bombers, every mission was a roll of the dice. They were flying in what were essentially unpressurized tin cans, where temperatures could plummet to 50 below zero. A single stray cannon shell could rupture an oxygen line, tear through a hydraulic system, or ignite a fuel tank. The air was a maelstrom of flak from the ground and machine gun fire from every direction. Bombers, once thought to be flying fortresses, were being ripped apart. Wings sheared off, engines exploded, and fuselages disintegrated in midair. The human cost was staggering. In the summer and fall of 1943, the U.S. 8th Air Force suffered casualties at a rate that was simply unsustainable. On missions to targets like Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the losses were catastrophic. Sometimes, 1 in 4 bombers that took off would not return. That meant 10 men per plane, 100 men, 200 men, gone in a single afternoon. The survivors would return to their bases in England, their planes riddled with holes, to see the empty beds and empty seats at the mess hall. The psychological toll was immense. The dream of winning the war through the air was collapsing under the weight of these horrific losses. The top brass of the Allied command faced a terrible choice. They could abandon daylight bombing altogether and admit defeat in the air war over Germany, a move that would have devastating consequences for the entire war effort. Or they could find another way. They needed a game changer, a technological leap forward that could tip the scales back in their favor. They needed a fighter plane that could not just challenge the Luftwaffe, but dominate it. A fighter with the speed, the firepower, and, most importantly, the range to fly all the way to Berlin and back. This wasn't just a technical problem. It was a race against time. The entire strategy for the invasion of Europe, the D-Day landings, depended on achieving air superiority. Without control of the skies, any invasion fleet would be decimated. The bombers had to get through, but they couldn't do it alone anymore. The call went out for a miracle with wings. The designers, the engineers, to test pilots, everyone was pushed to their absolute limit. They needed to build a long-range escort fighter, something that many believed was impossible given the technology of the day. And out of this crucible of desperation and innovation, a legend would be born. A plane that would change the course of the air war, and perhaps the entire Second World War. It was sleek, powerful, and deadly. It was the answer to the bomber crew's prayers. It had a name that would soon strike fear into the hearts of the Luftwaffe and become a symbol of American air power. The P-51 Mustang. This is the story of how that crisis in the burning skies of 1943 led to the creation of the fighter that would ultimately save the daylight bombing campaign and help clear the way for victory in Europe. The story of the Mustang is not just about a machine. It asks about the courage of the crews who flew into the fire and the ingenuity that gave them a fighting chance to come home. Thank you for watching. If you found this piece of history fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the annals of aviation and conflict. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. See you in the next one. April 1940. Europe is ablaze. The relentless roar of Nazi Germany's Luftwaffe echoes across the skies, a symphony of destruction that threatens to silence the free world. Britain stands alone, a defiant island nation, fighting for its very survival. The Battle of Britain is raging, and the Royal Air Force, the RAF, is stretched to its absolute limit. Their legendary Spitfires and Hurricanes are locked in a desperate, daily dance with death against the Messerschmitt Bf 109s. But it's not enough. They need more planes, many more, and they need them yesterday. In this moment of sheer desperation, the British Air Ministry casts a hopeful glance across the Atlantic. America is still neutral, a giant watching the storm from afar. But perhaps, just perhaps, they can find a helping hand. They don't turn to the established giants of aviation like Lockheed or Boeing. Instead, their plea reaches the doorstep of a relatively unknown, young company based in sunny California, North American Aviation. The British request is audacious, almost impossible. They need a brand new fighter plane. Not just any fighter, but one that can go toe-to-toe with the best Germany has to offer. And the deadline, 120 days. 4 months from a blank sheet of paper to a flying prototype. In an industry where designing a new aircraft typically takes years, this was seen as pure fantasy. To most, it was a fool's errand. But for North American Aviation, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. The company's lead designer, a brilliant but unassuming man named Edgar Schmood, accepts the challenge. He had previously worked with none other than Willy Messerschmitt in Germany, giving him a unique insight into the very aircraft he was now tasked to defeat. The pressure is immense. The fate of a nation, perhaps even the world, hangs in the balance. There's no time for traditional, lengthy development processes. Innovation has to happen at lightning speed. The design office at North American Aviation becomes a whirlwind of creative energy. Days blur into nights. The team, fueled by coffee and a burning sense of purpose, throws out the old rulebook. Ideas aren't just confined to blueprints. They're sketched on napkins during hurried lunches, scribbled on the backs of envelopes, and debated over makeshift models. Every single component, every curve and line, is scrutinized, refined, and they decide to incorporate a radical new piece of technology. The laminar flowing. It was a high-risk, high-reward concept developed by Naka, the predecessor to NASA. This wing design promised to dramatically reduce drag, allowing for incredible speed and fuel efficiency. It had never been successfully used on a fighter before. If it worked, it would be a game changer. If it failed, the entire project would collapse. They take the gamble. As the days tick by, a shape begins to emerge from the chaos of sketches and calculations. It's sleek, elegant, and aggressive. A long, streamlined fuselage, a revolutionary cooling system with its distinctive belly scoop, and of course, that cutting-edge laminar flow wing. It looks fast, even when standing still. They call it the NA-73X. This initial prototype, born from a desperate plea and forged in a crucible of frantic innovation, is the very first ancestor of a legend. On the 117th day, just 3 days shy of the impossible deadline, the NA-73X rolls out of the hangar. It stands gleaming under the California sun, a testament to what a small team of determined engineers could achieve against all odds. It's a machine built on hope, ingenuity, and countless sleepless nights. Little did anyone know, as they gazed upon this brand new aircraft, that they were witnessing the birth of the P-51 Mustang, the fighter that would not only answer Britain's desperate request, but would go on to dominate the skies, change the course of the air war, and etch its name into the very soul of aviation history. What started as a simple contract, a favor for an ally in need, had laid the foundation for an icon. The story of the Mustang is a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest legends are born from the most desperate of times. The desperate request from Britain had been answered, and in doing so, North American Aviation had unknowingly created the key that would help unlock victory in the skies over Europe. But the journey of this remarkable plane was only just beginning. 1941, the world is on fire, and the skies over Europe are a brutal arena. The Royal Air Force is desperate, fighting for its life against the Luftwaffe. They need an edge, something the enemy won't see coming. And from across the Atlantic, an answer is taking shape, an aircraft born from a transatlantic gamble. But this machine, the NA-73X, what we would come to know as the Mustang, had a secret weapon that would change everything. It was all in the wings. Picture this. For decades, aircraft wings were pretty much the same. They had a curved top, a flatter bottom, creating lift. It worked, but it also created a ton of drag, especially at high speeds. Drag is the enemy of speed and range. It's like trying to run through water. As you go faster, the resistance gets stronger. For pilots in 1941, this meant their planes hit a wall in the sky. They could only fly so fast, so far, before their engines were just fighting against the air itself. But a brilliant group of engineers at North American Aviation, led by Edgar Schmood and working with aerodynamicist Leland Atwood, looked at this problem and said, "We can do better." They didn't just tweak the old design, they threw out the rulebook. They embraced a radical, almost heretical idea known as the laminar flow airfoil. This wasn't just a small change, it was a revolution in aerodynamics. So what is a laminar flow wing? Imagine smoothing out the flow of water around a boat's hull. That's essentially what this new wing did for air. Instead of the air becoming turbulent and chaotic as it flowed over the wing, the new design kept the airflow smooth, or laminar, for much longer across the wing's surface. The thickest part of the wing was moved further back from the leading edge. This seemingly simple change had a staggering effect. It dramatically reduced drag. We're talking a massive improvement over anything flying at the time, including the legendary Spitfire. When the prototype, the NA-73X, first took to the skies, the test pilots were stunned. The aircraft was slippery, almost alive. It sliced through the air with an efficiency that felt like science fiction. It was faster than anyone had dared to hope. This new wing turned the Mustang from just another fighter into something truly special. It meant the plane could fly faster on the same amount of power, and it could cruise for incredible distances. The promise of a long-range escort fighter, a plane that could go all the way to Berlin and back, was suddenly within reach. A new world of aerial combat was dawning. The British, who had commissioned the plane, were impressed. They got their first batch, designated the Mustang Mark I, and immediately put them to use. But they quickly discovered a critical flaw, a bottleneck that was holding this incredible airframe back from its true potential. It was like having the body of a world-class sprinter but the lungs of a casual jogger. The aircraft was a low-altitude beast, a world beater below 15,000 feet. But up high, where the bombers flew and the real battles were fought, it struggled. The problem wasn't the wing, it was the heart of the machine. The engine. The early Mustangs were fitted with an Allison V1710 engine. Now, the Allison was a solid, reliable American engine. It was a workhorse, powering planes like the P-40 Warhawk and the P-38 Lightning. It was powerful and dependable at low to medium altitudes, but it had a crucial weakness. It was designed for the air densities found closer to the ground. As the Mustang climbed higher, the air got thinner, and the Allison engine began to gasp for breath. Its single-stage supercharger, the device that forces more air into the engine to maintain power at altitude, just couldn't keep up. Above 15,000 feet, the engine's performance would drop off a cliff. The pilot would feel the power bleeding away. The plane that was a lightning bolt near the ground became sluggish and vulnerable in the thin, cold air of the stratosphere. The German fighters, like the FW-190 and the later models of the Bf-109, were designed for high-altitude combat. They could literally fly circles around the Allison-powered Mustang up there. So you have this incredible paradox. An airframe years ahead of its time, a wing that could rewrite the rules of air-to-air combat, shackled to an engine that couldn't unlock its full power where it mattered most. It was a thoroughbred racehorse trying to run a marathon in the mountains. The potential was immense, but it was untapped. The dream of a fighter that could escort the heavy bombers all the way to their targets remained just that, a dream. The pilots of the Royal Air Force's Army Cooperation Command, who were the first to fly the Mustang in combat, loved it for low-level reconnaissance and ground attack missions. Its speed and agility made it perfect for rhubarb staring. Low-level sweeps over occupied Europe. They could zip in, hit their targets, and be gone before the enemy even knew what happened. It was a phenomenal tactical aircraft, but it wasn't the strategic war-winning weapon the Allies desperately needed. It was a fighter with a ceiling, both literally and figuratively. The story of the P-51 could have ended right there. It could have been remembered as a good, but not great, low-altitude fighter. A footnote in aviation history, but destiny had other plans. Across the English Channel, in the workshops of Rolls-Royce, another legend was being perfected. An engine with a two-stage, two-speed supercharger, an engine designed to breathe easy in the thin air of high altitude. That engine was the Merlin. The British saw the potential. They saw the beautiful, revolutionary airframe of the Mustang, and knew what it was missing. One clever test pilot at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, Ronnie Harker, after flying the Mustang, famously wrote a memo suggesting that the airframe with a Merlin engine would be It was a stroke of genius, a moment of insight that would connect the two missing pieces of the puzzle. The perfect body had been built in America. The perfect heart was beating in Britain. The marriage of these two innovations would not just improve the Mustang, it would transform it into the legendary aircraft that would dominate the skies and change the course of the war. A new world was waiting, and the key was about to be turned. By late 1942, the war in Europe was a brutal, grinding affair. Allied bombers were venturing deeper into enemy territory, but they were paying a heavy price. The Luftwaffe's fighters were merciless, and without long-range escorts, bomber crews were facing terrifying odds. The Allies desperately needed a game-changer, a fighter that could go the distance and dominate the skies. They needed a hero, and that hero was about to be born, thanks to a remarkable Anglo-American partnership. The story starts with the P-51 Mustang. It was a good plane, fast and agile at low altitudes, but it had a critical weakness. Its American-made Allison engine just couldn't breathe in the thin air of high altitudes. Above 15,000 feet, its performance plummeted. It was like a world-class sprinter trying to run a marathon at the top of Mount Everest. This was a huge problem, because the real fight, the battle to protect the bombers, was happening way up high, at 25,000 feet or more. The Mustang, in its original form, just couldn't compete up there. But across the Atlantic, British test pilots saw something special in the Mustang. They recognized its superb aerodynamic design. They saw its potential. One of these pilots, a man named Ronnie Harker, had a revolutionary idea. He looked at the sleek airframe of the P-51 and then thought of Britain's own legendary engine, the Rolls-Royce Merlin. This was the same engine that powered the iconic Spitfire and Hurricane, the very heart of the Royal Air Force. Harker scribbled a memo, a simple suggestion that would change the course of air combat forever. What if, he proposed, we put a Merlin in the Mustang? It was a bold idea. Mating a British engine with an American airframe was a complex engineering challenge, almost like a transplant of a heart from one species to another. But the stakes were too high to ignore the possibility. The engineers at Rolls-Royce got to work. They took a few Mustang airframes, designated them Mustang X, and began the intricate process of fitting the powerful two-stage. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. It was immediate and dramatic. The moment the Merlin-powered Mustang took to the skies, everyone knew they had a winner. The sluggish Huatuda performance was gone, replaced by breathtaking speed and power. The new Mustang, which would soon be designated the P-51B, could climb like a rocket and was wickedly fast. Even at 40,000 feet, it was reborn. The Sprinter had not only learned to run a marathon, but it could do it faster than anyone else. This wasn't just a minor upgrade. It was a complete metamorphosis. The P-51B and its bubble canopy successor, the P-51D, became the definitive long-range escort fighters of the war. They could fly all the way to Berlin and back, sticking to the bombers like glue and tearing into any German fighters that dared to challenge them. The sight of those silver, shark-like fighters gave Allied bomber crews a fighting chance, a sense of hope they hadn't felt before. The German pilots, who had previously ruled the high skies, were in for a rude awakening. They called the new Mustangs the little friends of the bombers, but there was nothing friendly about them in a dogfight. The Merlin Mustang could outclimb, outrun, and outfight Germany's best. The Messerschmitt, Bf 109, and the Focke-Wulf 190 at the altitudes where it mattered most. The balance of power in the air war over Europe began to shift decisively. The impact was profound, with the Mustangs clearing the skies. Allied bombers could strike at the heart of Germany's war machine with greater accuracy and fewer losses. The relentless bombing campaign crippled German industry, fuel production, and transportation networks, paving the way for the D-Day invasion and the final push towards victory. The P-51, empowered by its British heart, had become the ultimate weapon of air superiority. This incredible story of the Merlin Mustang is a testament to innovation and international cooperation. It shows how a simple idea, a what-if moment from a perceptive test pilot, could lead to a technological leap that would alter history. It was the perfect marriage of American design and British engineering, creating what many consider to be the single best piston-engine fighter of World War II. It wasn't just a plane, it was a symbol of Allied ingenuity and determination. The Mustang didn't just escort bombers, it escorted the Allies all the way to victory. In the dark days of 1943, a grim reality hung over the Allied bomber crews of the 8th Air Force. Flying deep into enemy territory, they were hunters, but they were also the hunters. Their trusty escorts, the Spitfires, and P-47 Thunderbolts were incredible fighters, but they had a fatal flaw. Short legs. Once they reached their fuel limits and turned for home, the bombers were left vulnerable, like sheep abandoned to wolves. The Luftwaffe's fighters would then descend, and the sky would fill with smoke and fire. The losses were staggering. Unsustainable. A solution was desperately needed. A guardian angel with the range to go all the way to Berlin and back. The Allies were bleeding, and the clock was ticking. Enter a revolutionary idea. A gamble that would change the course of the air war. Engineers at North American Aviation had a radical design. The P-51 Mustang. Its early versions showed promise, but lacked the high-altitude performance needed to truly dominate. The British, however, saw its potential and had a stroke of genius. What if they combined this sleek American airframe with their own legendarians? The Rolls-Royce Merlin. It was an unprecedented transatlantic marriage of technology, a hybrid of the best of both worlds. The result was the P-51B. On paper, it looked like a world beater. But theories and blueprints are one thing. The unforgiving reality of the sky is another. In March of 1943, the moment of truth arrived. At a windswept airfield, the first P-51B Mustang sat gleaming on the tarmac. It looked different, more menacing. The deep, powerful chin scoop housing the Merlin's intercooler gave it an aggressive profile. It was a fusion of American and British engineering, and the air was thick with anticipation and skepticism. Could this new creation truly be the answer to their prayers? Seasoned test pilots, men who had flown everything with wings, circled the aircraft. They were a tough crowd to impress, having seen countless designs, promised the moon, and failed to leave the launch pad. They approached the P-51B with a professional curiosity, tempered by the hard-won experience that made them wary of hype. One of those pilots, a veteran with hundreds of combat hours, climbed into the cockpit. The layout was clean, functional, a pilot's office designed for business. He ran through the pre-flight checks, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. The Merlin engine coughed to life, not with a roar, but with a deep, resonant growl that vibrated through the very bones of the airframe. It was a sound of immense, barely contained power. He taxied onto the runway, the canopy sealed, isolating him in a bubble of focus. With a final clearance from the tower, he pushed the throttle forward. The response was instantaneous. The Merlin engine didn't just accelerate, it unleashed. The Mustang surged down the runway with a ferocity that pressed him back into his seat. It felt alive, eager. In a shockingly short distance, it lifted, off climbing not just with speed, but with an authority that defied gravity. As he climbed higher, the true magic of the P-51B began to reveal itself. At 15,000 feet, where other fighters started to feel sluggish, the Mustang was just getting started. The supercharged Merlin engine thrived in the thin, cold air. The pilot pushed the stick, and the plane responded as if it were an extension of his own thoughts. He rolled, looped, and dove. The controls were light, crisp, and perfectly balanced. It had the agility of a lightweight interceptor, but the stability of a heavy fighter. He could throw it around the sky with abandon, yet it never felt like it was on the verge of losing control. It was a dancer and a brawler, all in one. Then came the real test. Speed. He leveled off and pushed the throttle to the firewall. The needle on the airspeed indicator swept past marks that were once the exclusive domain of specialized, high-speed racers. The landscape below became a blur. The hum of the engines settled into a smooth, powerful thrum. There was no shudder, no vibration, just pure, unadulterated speed. He was flying faster than any Allied fighter had a right to fly, and he was doing it with ease. He was outrunning everything in the sky, and the aircraft felt like it still had more to give. It was a breathtaking, mind-altering experience. The legend was being born, not in a design document, but right there, tens of thousands of feet in the air. But speed and agility were only part of the equation. The bomber crew's lives depended on one more crucial factor: range. The P-51B was designed from the ground up for long-haul missions. Its internal fuel tanks, combined with the Merlin engines, surprising efficiency at cruise speeds, gave it unprecedented. After putting the aircraft through its paces with good trenching maneuvers and high-speed runs, the pilot checked his fuel gauges. He was stunned. He had been airborne for a significant amount of time, flying aggressively, yet the needles had barely moved. The implications were immediate and profound. This aircraft could fly to the heart of Germany, loiter over the target, engage the enemy, and still have enough fuel to escort the bombers all the way home. When the test pilot finally landed, he was almost speechless. He unstrapped himself and climbed out of the cockpit, his face a mixture of exhilaration and disbelief. The ground crew and engineers rushed over, their faces etched with nervous anticipation. "Well, how is she?" one of them asked. The pilot just shook his head slowly, a wide grin spreading across his face. "She's not a plane," he said, his voice filled with awe. "She's a miracle. We can finally take the war to them." The word spread like wildfire. Other pilots took their turns, and each one came back with the same story, the same look of wonder in their eyes. They had flown the future. They called it the Cadillac of the sky. It was sleek, powerful, and comfortable for the long journeys ahead. The birth of the P-51B Mustang wasn't just a successful test flight. It was a seismic shift in the balance of air power. News of its performance reached the highest levels of command, offering a glimmer of hope that had been so desperately missing. The problem of the unescorted bomber was solved. Production was ramped up with frantic urgency. Soon, squadrons of these new, deadly fighters began arriving in England. When the bomber crews saw them for the first time, these silver little friends that promised to stick with them through hell and back, their morale soared. For the Luftwaffe pilots waiting to pounce on the bomber streams, the arrival of the Mustang was a devastating shock. They would climb to intercept, expecting to find lumbering bombers protected by short-range escorts, only to be met by swarms of fighters that could outclimb, outrun, and outturn their own. The myth of German air superiority over the Reich was about to be shattered. The P-51B Mustang had arrived, and the sky would never be the same again. October 1943. Deep inside Nazi-occupied Europe, a shadow loomed over the American war effort. The U.S. 8th Air Force, the mighty 8th, was bleeding to death in the skies over Germany. Their mission was vital: to cripple the Third Reich Hess war machine by bombing its industrial heart. But the cost was becoming unbearable. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, was still a formidable, lethal power. Their fighter pilots were experienced, battle-hardened, and flying some of the most advanced interceptors of the time, like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf 190 for the Anglo-American crews. Flying the B-17, flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators. Each mission was a journey into the very heart of darkness. The strategy seemed straightforward. Fly in tight, self-defending formations, using the combined firepower of hundreds of .50 caliber machine guns to create a protective box of lead. But the reality was far grimmer. The bombers were big, relatively slow targets. Once their shorter-ranged fighter escorts, like the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning, had to turn back at the edge of German airspace. The bomber formations were left exposed. It was at this moment that the Luftwaffe would pounce. They were the wolves, and the bombers were the flock. German pilots developed brutal tactics, like head-on attacks, where the closing speed was over 500 miles per hour, giving the American gunners mere seconds to react. They would fly through the formations, cannons and machine guns blazing, turning the orderly bomber boxers into scenes of chaos and horror. The industrial city of Schweinfurt was a prime example. It was home to the majority of Germany's ball bearing factories, a critical component for everything from tanks to aircraft. Taking out Schweinfurt could, in theory, grind the German war machine to a halt. The 8th Air Force tried. On August 17, 1943, they launched a massive dual raid on Schweinfurt and another aircraft factory in Regensburg. The losses were staggering. 60 heavy bombers, each with a crew of 10 men, were shot out of the sky. 600 airmen were lost in a single day. The sky was filled with fireballs, parachutes, and the debris of shattered aluminum, but they had to try again. The pressure was on. So, on October 14th, 1943, a date that would be forever known as Black Thursday, the 8th launched another major assault on. This time, it was even worse. Without long-range fighter protection for the entire journey, the bomber stream was mercilessly savaged by over 300 German fighters. Again, 60 B-17s were lost. Many more were damaged beyond repair. Over a quarter of the attacking force was wiped out. The losses were simply unsustainable. The 8th Air Force was being bled white. Morale plummeted. It seemed the entire concept of unescorted daylight strategic bombing was a catastrophic failure. Some commanders even questioned if they could continue the bombing campaign at all. The hunters of the Luftwaffe reigned supreme, and the American bombers were their helpless prey. The heart of darkness was winning, but in the darkest hour, a new light was beginning to glimmer on the horizon. It came in the form of an aircraft that would change the very nature of the air war. It was sleek, it was fast, and it had the one thing the 8th Air Force desperately needed: range. It was the P-51 Mustang. Initially developed with a different engine, the Mustang was a decent plane, but not a game changer. That is, until a brilliant stroke of engineering genius paired its advanced airframe with the legendary British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The result was a thoroughbred fighter, a high-altitude, long-range killing machine. The arrival of the P-51B and C models in England at the end of 1943 was the turning point. Equipped with drop tanks, these new Mustangs could fly all the way to Berlin and back. They could stick with the bombers from takeoffs to target and all the way home. The days of the undefended bomber stream were over. The American commanders, led by visionaries like General Jimmy Doolittle, changed tactics. No longer were the fighters tied to the bombers in a purely defensive screen. Doolittle's famous order was simple: go find them, hunt them, kill them. The fighter pilots were unleashed. The effect was immediate and devastating for the Luftwaffe. German fighter pilots who had grown accustomed to attacking lumbering bombers now found themselves ambushed by swarms of deadly American fighters. When they rose to attack the B-17SA, the Mustangs were waiting for them. Higher up, diving out of the sun, the hunters had become the hunted. The skill of the German aces was now matched by the aggression and numbers of the American Mustang pilots. The dogfights that ensued were some of the largest and most ferocious in history. Fought miles above the European landscape, the Mustang pilots, many of them young men in their early 20s, racked up incredible victory tallies. They were clearing the skies. By the spring of 1944, the tide had completely turned. The once invincible Luftwaffe was being systematically dismantled. The P-51s not only protected the bombers, but also went on the offensive, strafing German airfields, trains, and troop columns, creating chaos on the ground. They were chasing the German fighters back to their own bases, shooting them down as they tried to land. This relentless pressure broke the back of the Luftwaffe. They lost their best pilots, their experienced leaders, and they couldn't replace them fast enough. The air superiority that was crucial for the D-Day invasion in June 1944 was won in those brutal months by the pilots of the 8th Air Force. Flying their little friends, the journey into the heart of darkness had been terrifying and costly. The sacrifice of the bomber crews in 1943 was not in vain. They had absorbed the blows, they had paid the price, and they had held on just long enough for their saviors to arrive. The P-51 Mustang didn't just save the 8th Air Force. It crushed the Luftwaffe and cleared the path for the final victory in Europe. It was a testament to innovation, strategy, and the courage of the flyers who, against all odds, flew into the fire and emerged triumphant. Early 1944. The shadow of doubt hung heavy over the Allied bombing campaign. 4 months. 4 months. The mighty B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators had braved the treacherous skies over Germany, their mission to cripple the Nazi war machine from above. But the cost was staggering. Beyond the range of their fighter escorts, these big friends were left vulnerable, facing a gauntlet of lethal German fighters and relentless anti-aircraft fire. The losses were becoming unsustainable. Men and machines were being chewed up by the Luftwaffe, and the strategic bombing effort, a cornerstone of Allied strategy, was on the brink of failure. Every mission was a gamble, with bomber crews flying deep into enemy territory, knowing their chances of returning were terrifyingly slim. This brutal reality led to a critical question echoing through the halls of Allied High Command. Could they continue? Was the price in blood and treasure too high? Some influential voices argued for a halt, suggesting that the losses outweighed the strategic gains. The dream of daylight precision bombing seemed to be turning into a nightmare. The German defenses were just too strong, too deeply layered. The bombers were being bled dry. Without a solution, and fast, the entire air war over Europe might have to be rethought, potentially altering the course of the war itself. The stakes could not have been higher. Then, a game-changer arrived. It wasn't a new bomber or a new tactic, but a fighter plane that would fundamentally rewrite the rules of aerial combat. The North American P-51 Mustang. It was sleek, fast, and powerfully armed. But its initial design had one critical limitation: its range. Equipped with its original Allison engine, it was a superb low-altitude fighter but lacked the performance needed for high-altitude escort missions deep into Germany. It was a thoroughbred racehorse, but it couldn't run the marathon. Early on, it was good for skirmishes over the French coast, but the skies over Berlin remained a deadly no-man's land for Allied bombers. The true potential of the Mustang was unlocked by a stroke of genius not from a new airframe, but from a new heart. British ingenuity suggested fitting the P-51 with their own legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The combination was magical. The Merlin transformed the Mustang, giving it spectacular heel-to-toe performance that could match, and often surpass, anything the Luftwaffe could put in the sky. Suddenly, the Allies had a fighter that could climb high and fight hard where it mattered most. But one final piece of the puzzle was needed to turn this exceptional fighter into a strategic weapon: the ability to go the distance. That final piece was the drop tank. It was a simple, yet revolutionary concept. Auxiliary fuel tanks, teardrop-shaped, and slung under the wings, that could be jettisoned once empty. Engineers worked tirelessly, first with 75-gallon tanks, then 108-gallon tanks, and even larger custom paper tanks. With these, the Mustang's operational radius exploded. Its range stretched to an unprecedented 1,600 miles. Think about that. A fighter plane could now take off from a base in England, fly all the way to Berlin, engage in furious combat over the target, and then fly all the way back. The little friends could now stay with the big friends for the entire journey. For the bomber crews, the sight of those silver-winged angels sticking with them was a profound relief. For the first time, they weren't alone. One B-17 pilot recalled looking out his cockpit window over central Germany and seeing Mustangs weaving a protective shield around his formation. It was a moment, he said, that brought tears to his eyes. The psychological boost was a measurable morale sword. They now had a fighting chance. A guardian angel with a Merlin engine and 6 50-caliber machine guns. The era of the undefended bomber was over. For the Luftwaffe, however, the arrival of the long-range Mustang was a catastrophe. Their entire air defense strategy had been built around a simple premise: intercepting and destroying bombers in the vast, unprotected airspace beyond the reach of Allied escorts. They would let the bombers come to them, saving their fuel and fighters for the kill zone deep inside Germany. Suddenly, That strategy was shattered. There was no more safe space. The hunters had become the hunt. Mustangs didn't just passively escort. They actively sought out and destroyed German fighters. General Jimmy Doolittle, the new commander of the 8th Air Force, issued a legendary directive. Fighters are to be released from close escort. Your first duty is to destroy German fighters. This was a declaration of total war in the air. Mustang pilots were unleashed. They would sweep ahead of the bomber streams, clearing the skies. They would dive down and attack German airfields, catching fighters on the ground as they tried to refuel and The Luftwaffe was forced into a war of attrition they simply could not win. They were being attacked everywhere in the air, on the ground on their way up, and on their way down. The effect was devastating. The German air defense system began to collapse under this relentless pressure. Experienced Luftwaffe pilots, the vital core of their fighter force, were being systematically eliminated. For every Allied fighter lost, the Germans were losing several, along with their irreplaceable veteran pilots. Novice German airmen were being thrown into battle against seasoned American and British pilots flying a superior aircraft. It was a slaughter. The protective wall the Luftwaffe had built around the Reich was being dismantled, piece by piece, day by day. The long reach of the Mustang did more than just protect bombers. It broke the back of the German Air Force. By clearing the skies, it paved the way for D-Day. When the Allied invasion fleet crossed the English Channel on June 6, 1944, the once feared Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, unable to effectively intervene. The supremacy of the air, won in the skies over Berlin and Munich, was the key that unlocked the door to Fortress Europe. The P-51 Mustang, with its drop tanks and Merlin engine, had not only saved the bombing campaign, but had also become one of the most decisive weapons of the entire war. Ever wonder how the Allies won the skies over Europe in World War II? It wasn't overnight. It was a brutal, calculated campaign that came to a head in one pivotal week. By early 1944, the American 8th Air Force had been taking a beating. The B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators were tough, but flying deep into Germany without fighter escort was a suicide mission. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, was still a formidable opponent, filled with battle-hardened asses. Every bombing run meant staggering losses. The Allies knew something had to change, or the air warrant, perhaps. The entire war could be lost. The solution was a game-changer. The P-51 Mustang. With its incredible range, it could fly all the way to Berlin and back, sticking to the bombers like glue. This was the missing piece of the puzzle. General Jimmy Doolittle, the new commander of the 8th Air Force, had a radical new strategy. He famously ordered, "Your first duty is to destroy German fighters." Instead of just passively protecting the bombers, the fighters were unleashed. They were to hunt, seek out, and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever they found it. This set the stage for a massive, all-out confrontation that would be known as Big Week. The plan, officially Operation Argument, was audacious. For 6 straight days, a relentless storm of over 1,000 heavy bombers, escorted by nearly as many fighters, would hammer the heart of the German aircraft industry. The targets weren't cities. They were the factories building the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs that plagued the Allied bombers. The logic was simple and brutal. If the bombers attacked these critical targets, the Luftwaffe would have no choice but to rise and defend them. And when they did, the Mustangs would be waiting. On February 20th, 1944, the largest air armada the world had ever seen took to the skies. The scale was immense. Imagine looking up and seeing the sky filled, horizon to horizon, with thousands of planes. For the crews, this was it. The tension in the briefing rooms was electric. They knew they were flying into the teeth of the German defenses. But this time, day hot day, little friends. The Mustangs, Lightnings, and Thunderbolts flying with them all the way. The Luftwaffe rose to the challenge, just as planned. The skies over Germany turned into a chaotic, swirling melee of dogfight. German pilots, many of them veterans of countless battles, were shocked to find American fighters still with the bombers so deep inside the Reich. They were used to picking off unescorted bombers at their leisure. Now, they had to fight through a hornet's nest of P-51s just to get a shot. The American pilots, eager for a fight, dove into the fray. The air was a crisscross of tracer fire and smoke trails from dying aircraft. Day after day, the onslaught continued. Bombers pounded factories in Leipzig, Brunswick, and Regensburg. The damage on the ground was immense. Production of new German fighter planes was crippled, but the real battle was being fought miles above, in the frozen, thin air. The Luftwaffe threw everything they had into the fight. They tried new tactics, like massed company front attacks. But the American fighter pilots adapted, breaking up their formations and engaging them in brutal one-on-one combat. For the bomber crews, it was still terrifying. Flak still peppered the sky, and determined German pilots sometimes broke through the fighter screen. But the difference was night and day. Seeing those Mustangs out on their wings, chasing down enemy fighters, was a massive morale boost. They weren't alone anymore. They had a fighting chance. The airwaves crackled with the calls of pilots. Bandits at 6 o'clock. Hi. Followed by the reassuring, Roger, I'm on him. The cost was high on both sides. The Americans lost over 200 bombers and more than 100 fighters during Big Week. Thousands of airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. But the toll on the Luftwaffe was catastrophic. They lost over 600 aircraft. More importantly, they lost hundreds of their most experienced, irreplaceable pilots. These were the aces, the veterans who had been fighting since the early days of the war. You can replace a plane in a few weeks, but you can't replace a pilot with 5 years of combat experience. This was the core of Doolittle's strategy. To force a battle of attrition that the Germans simply couldn't win. Germany was already stretched thin, fighting on multiple fronts. They didn't have the fuel, the training facilities, or the pool of experienced instructors to quickly replace these losses. Novice pilots were being rushed to the front lines, often with only minimal training. They were no match for the well-trained, aggressive American pilots flying the superior P-51. The aftermath of Big Week was decisive. In the months that followed, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. American bomber losses plummeted. The hunters had become the hunted. Now, American fighters roamed freely over Germany, strafing airfields, trains, and anything else that moved. They had achieved total air superiority. By the time the D-Day landings occurred in June 1944, the Luftwaffe was virtually absent from the skies over Normandy. The Allied soldiers storming the beaches didn't have to worry about being attacked from the air, a luxury that was bought with the blood of the aircrews who fought during Big Week. Big Week broke the back of the Luftwaffe. It was a brutal, week-long slugfest that crippled Germany's ability to defend its own skies. The courage of the bomber crews who flew into that inferno, and the skill of the fighter pilots who protected them, changed the course of the air war. It was a turning point, proving that in modern warfare, control of the sky is the key to victory on the ground. It's June 5th, 1944. Just hours before the largest amphibious invasion in history. As thousands of ships steamed across the English Channel, another battle is already raging in the skies over France. This isn't a battle of grand dogfights or massive bomber formations. This is a battle of strangulation, a systematic dismantling of the enemy's ability to fight back. And the weapon of choice has a legendary name: Mustang. For the Allied planners, one nightmare scenario loomed larger than any other. German panzer divisions rolling towards the Normandy beaches, smashing the invasion force before it could establish a foothold. The success of D-Day, the liberation of Europe, it all hinged on one critical factor: preventing those reinforcements from ever reaching the coast. This colossal task fell to the pilots of the United States Army Air Forces, and specifically, to the men flying the P-51 Mustang. The P-51 Mustang wasn't just a good fighter, it was a revolution. With its incredible range, thanks to those iconic drop tanks, it could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. But on the eve of D-Day, its mission changed. It became a hunter, a predator unleashed upon the French countryside. The Mustang pilots were given a simple, brutal directive: destroy everything that moves. From dawn till dusk, on June 5th, the skies over northern France were a hornet's nest of Allied air power. Squadrons of Mustangs flew at treetop level, their Merlin engines roaring a symphony of impending doom for the German forces below. Their targets weren't enemy fighters, but the arteries of the German war machine. Imagine you're a German soldier in a convoy, rumbling down a French country road. You feel a false sense of security under the thick canopy of trees. Suddenly, the air rips apart. A silver flash, a glint of sun on a plexiglass canopy. Before you can even react, a stream of 50 caliber bullets tears through your truck, turning metal into Swiss cheese and chaos. Into catastrophe. This was the reality for thousands of German troops that day. The Mustang pilots were relentless. They were masters of this low-level game. They strafed trains, blowing boilers and derailing cars filled with vital supplies. They hunted down supply trucks, staff cars, and even solitary dispatch riders on motorcycles. They looked for the telltale signs of a hidden enemy. Dust clouds on a back road, track marks in a field, the glint of a helmet. Nothing was too small a target. These weren't just random acts of destruction. This was a carefully orchestrated campaign. Pilots were given specific zones to patrol, so-called killing boxers, where they were free to engage any and all enemy targets. They worked in pairs or flights of 4, one group flying high cover while the others dove down for the attack. A deadly, coordinated dance. Railway lines were a primary target. A single, well-placed locomotive destroyed could block a line for hours, or even days. The Mustangs would prowl the tracks, and once a train was spotted, the attack was swift and merciless. The pilots would aim for the engine, the heart of the train. A successful strike would send a geyser of steam and smoke into the air, a visible tombstone marking another victory for Allied air power. The wreckage would then be strafed repeatedly to ensure it couldn't be easily cleared. Roads were even more dangerous for the Germans. Convoys were sitting ducks. The moment a Mustang pilot spotted a line of trucks, it was a race to see how many could be destroyed before they scattered for cover. The pilots would come in low and fast, their guns blazing. The 50 caliber, armor-piercing incendiary rounds were devastating, easily punching through the thin skin of the trucks and igniting fuel tanks and ammunition. For the German soldier on the ground, it was a living hell. The constant threat from above was psychologically shattering. Any movement during daylight was a death sentence. It forced units to travel only at night, slowing their progress to a crawl. It severed communication lines and created a state of perpetual fear and paralysis. Powerful panzer divisions, which could have turned the tide at Omaha or Utah Beach, were stuck, sometimes hundreds of miles away, harassed and battered from the air. This was the unseen victory of D-Day. While the world's attention would soon be fixed on the landing craft hitting the beaches, the foundation for that success was being laid in the skies above. The Allied High Command understood a simple truth. The invasion could not succeed without air supremacy, but the pilots of the P-51 Mustang took that concept a step further. They achieved air dominance. The Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. It had been beaten back, its fighters held in reserve to defend the German homeland, leaving the ground troops terrifyingly exposed. The sky over France on June 5, 1944, belonged to the Allies. And air dominance had a name. It was the North American P-51 Mustang. The pilots who flew them weren't just escorting bombers anymore. They were the tip of the spear, the guardians of the invasion. They ensured that when the ramps dropped on the morning of June 6, the soldiers splashing ashore would face only the defenders in front of them, not the full might of the German army. The success of the longest day was written in the contrails and tracers that crisscrossed the sky the day before. Summer 1944. The skies over Europe are a deadly chessboard. High above, formations of B-17, flying fortresses, and B-4. Liberators push deeper into the heart of the Third Reich. Their mission, to cripple Germany's war machine. But every mile they travel, every bomb they drop, comes at a terrible price. The Luftwaffe's fighters, swift and lethal, rise to meet them. For the bomber crews, the journey is a grueling test of courage, a flight into a hornet's nest with no guarantee of return. Before 1944, the bomber always got through, but the losses were staggering. The unescorted daylight bombing raids were becoming unsustainable. The 8th Air Force was losing more men than the Marine Corps in the Pacific. They needed a hero. They needed a guardian angel. And they got one with a sleek profile and a roar that would become the sound of hope. They got the P-51 Mustang. The story of the Mustang is a transatlantic epic. It begins not in America, but in Great Britain. In 1940, The British Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation with a request. They needed a new fighter. Fast. They wanted the company to build the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk under license. But North American's lead designer, Edgar Schmidt, had a better idea. He promised them a brand new, superior aircraft. And he promised it in an unbelievably short time. In just 120 days, they went from a clean sheet of paper to a prototype. The result was the NA-73X, the ancestor of the Mustang. Early Mustangs, powered by the Allison V1710 engine, were impressive at low altitudes. They served well with the Royal Air Force as reconnaissance and ground attack aircraft. But high up, where the bombers fought and died, the Allison engine gasped for air. It lost power, and the Mustang couldn't compete with Germany's best. The plane had incredible potential. A revolutionary airframe with a laminar flow wing designed for speed. But it lacked the right heart. The breakthrough came from a stroke of genius. A perfect marriage of American engineering and British innovation. A Rolls-Royce test pilot, Ronnie Harker, flew an early Mustang and was amazed by its handling. He famously suggested that, with their powerful Merlin engine, they would have a real game-changer. The idea took flight. Engineers on both sides of the Atlantic worked feverishly to fit the supercharged Rolls-Royce Merlin engine into the Mustang S airframe. The result was the P-51B, and later the iconic bubble-canopied P-51D. It was a transformation. The Geburtengrad fighter became legendary. The Merlin-powered Mustang could climb like a rocket, dance with the best German fighters at over 30,000 feet, and, most importantly, it had legs. With external drop tanks, it had the range to fly from bases in England all the way to Berlin and back. The little friends, as the bomber crews called them, could finally stay with the big friends for the entire duration of their perilous missions. Imagine being a young gunner in the tail of a B-17, 7 miles high, the air freezing cold, flak bursting all around you. 4 hours, you've been scanning the sky, your heart pounding, waiting for the dreaded glint of sunlight on the canopy of an attacking Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf. Then, you see them. Specks in the distance, closing fast. But, Tistam, something is different. Between you and the enemy, another group of fighters appears. Sleek, silver, with checkerboard noses and distinctive square wingtips. The Mustangs have arrived. For the bomber crews, the sight of those P-51s was like the cavalry cresting the hill. It was a wave of relief, a breath of life. The Mustang pilots were aggressive, skilled, and utterly fearless. They broke up enemy formations before they could even begin their attack runs. They dove into dogfights, their 650 caliber machine guns tearing through the enemy. The German pilots, who had once feasted on the vulnerable bomber streams, now faced a formidable opponent who could outfly, outrun, and outlast them. The commander of the German Air Force, Hermann Hay, written, famously sighed. "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." He understood the strategic implication. The Allies could now project air power anywhere over his homeland, protecting the bombers that were systematically dismantling Germany's industrial capacity. The Mustang didn't just win dogfights. It won the air war. From the sprawling fields of England to the dense forests of Germany, the Mustang became more than just a machine of war. It was a symbol of Allied cooperation, where an American airframe was perfected by a British engine. It was a symbol of freedom's long reach, a promise to the beleaguered bomber crews that they were not alone. Each Mustang was a steel-winged testament to the determination to see the war through to victory. Pilots loved the Mustang. They called it their Cadillac of the sky. It was fast, agile, and responsive. In the hands of aces like Doane Blakesley, George Spredy, and Chuck Yeager, it was an artist's brush, painting victory across the European canvas. These pilots and their P-51s cleared the skies, allowing the Allied bombers to strike with devastating precision. They hunted the advanced German jet and rocket fighters, ensuring that even Hitler's secret weapons couldn't turn the tide. The legacy of the P-51 Mustang is etched in the history of the Second World War. It was the plane that broke the back of the Luftwaffe. It was the shield that protected the bombers, saving countless lives and enabling the strategic bombing campaign that hastened the end of the war in Europe. It was born from a British need, crafted by American ingenuity, and powered by British brilliance. A true thoroughbred, the P-51 Mustang was, and remains, the ultimate wing of freedom. As the spring of 1945 painted Europe in shades of green and hope, the skies told a different story. It was a story of relentless pursuit of the final. Desperate battles fought in the twilight of the Third Reich. This was the stage for the P-51 Mustang's last great act in the European theater of operations. The war was ending, but for the pilots of the 8th and 9th Air Forces, the job wasn't done until the very last gun fell silent. By April, the German war machine was a hollowed-out shell, crumbling from within and battered from without. Allied armies were closing in from east and west, squeezing the life out of a regime that had once seemed invincible. But even in its death throes, the Wehrmacht was dangerous. Remnants of the once mighty Luftwaffe, though scarce and starved for fuel, could still bite. On-the-ground German forces scrambled to reposition, to consolidate, to make one last stand. For the Mustang pilots, the mission had shifted. The great air battles of 1944 were largely a memory. The new directive was simple: find and destroy anything that could prolong the war. The P-51s became hunters, their silver wings glinting in the sun as they roamed deep into German airspace, often alone or in small groups. Their prey was no longer just the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, but the very arteries of the German army. The trains, the truck convoys, the staff cars. Every locomotive destroyed was a trainload of troops or supplies that wouldn't reach the front. Every truck strafed was a logistical headache for a German general trying to mount a defense. Pilots would return from missions with their gun ports blackened, their ammunition expended on targets of opportunity scattered across the German countryside. These weren't glorious dogfights for the newspapers back home. This was gritty, dangerous work. Flying low and fast to strafe a moving train or a camouflaged convoy exposed the Mustangs to a deadly web of ground fire. German units, no matter how desperate, were armed with flak 20mm and 37mm cannons. A single well-placed shell could rip through a Mustang's liquid-cooled engine, turning a state-of-the-art fighter into a plummeting coffin. Pilots had to balance aggression with caution, diving in for a kill but knowing when to pull up and away from the hail of tracers reaching for them from below. One of the most symbolic missions of this period was the escort of bombers to Berlin itself. The Big B had been the most heavily defended target in all of Germany, a fortress of flak and fighters. Now, in April 1945, the Mustangs escorted B-17s and B-24s over a smoldering, devastated city with little to no aerial opposition. It was a surreal experience for the bomber crews and their little friends. They were flying over the heart of the enemy empire, a place that had claimed so many of their comrades, and the skies were eerily empty. The P-51s circled lazily, their job reduced to a watchful overflight, a final, dominant assertion of the air superiority they had fought so hard to win. Even in these final weeks, the Luftwaffe could still surprise. On April 7th, Sonderkommando Elbe, a desperate suicide unit of the Luftwaffe, was activated. Young, barely trained pilots were sent up in stripped-down fighters with the sole mission of ramming Allied bombers. Though the material impact of these attacks was minimal, the psychological shock was significant. It was a stark reminder of the fanaticism the Allies were still facing. On that same day, the new German jet fighters, the Messerschmitt Me-262s, also made their presence felt. A large formation of these futuristic jets, faster than any propeller-driven plane, rose to challenge the American bombers. This set the stage for one of the final great dogfights of the war. The Mustang pilots of the 357th Fighter Group, the famed Oxford Boys, met the challenge. This beat the Me-262's incredible speed advantage. The experienced Mustang pilots used their superior numbers, turning ability, and well-honed tactics. They dove on the jets from above, forcing them into defensive turns where the P-51 could get a shot. It was a clash of Arista, pinnacle of piston engine design against the dawn of the jet age. When the skies cleared, the Mustangs had claimed over a dozen jets for the loss of only a few of their own. It was a stunning victory, proving that even with a technological disadvantage, pilot skill and tactical doctrine were what truly mattered. These missions were a mix of the mundane and the terrifying. One day, a pilot might fly a milk run, seeing nothing but the sprawling, defeated landscape below. The next, he could find himself in a life-or-death struggle against a hidden flak battery or a lone, determined FW-190 pilot. They escorted photo reconnaissance planes that were mapping the final dispositions of German forces. They flew rhubarb missions, freelance sweeps over enemy territory, looking for anything that moved. Every flight was a roll of the dice. One of the most unique targets in these final days were the airfields themselves. Mustang groups would descend at treetop level, strafing rows of parked German aircraft. Many of these planes were brand new, including dozens of Me-262 jets. But they were grounded for lack of fuel, lack of pilots, or simply the chaos of a collapsing front. It was a frustrating sight for the German high command. But for the Allied pilots, it was a necessary task. Every plane destroyed on the ground was one that couldn't make a final, desperate flight. The psychological toll on the pilots was immense. They were so close to the end, so close to victory and going home. The thought of being one of the last casualties of the war was a heavy burden. Every takeoff was a mix of duty and dread. They had seen so many friends fall, and the desire to simply survive was overwhelming. Yet, they flew. They flew because the job wasn't finished. They flew for the soldiers on the ground, for the bomber crews they protected, and for the buddies who wouldn't be making the trip home. On May 8, 1945, the news they had all been waiting for finally arrived. Victory in Europe. The war was over. The guns fell silent. The continent, battered and broken, took its first breath of peace in nearly 6 years. For the pilots of the P-51 Mustang, it was a moment of profound, indescribable relief. There would be no more pre-dawn briefings, no more gut-wrenching takeoffs into hostile skies, no more watching for the black puffs of flak or the glint of an enemy fighter in the sun. As they parked their aircraft for the last time, these young men, most still in their early 20s, could look back on an incredible legacy. The P-51 Mustang had arrived when it was needed most. It had broken the back of the Luftwaffe, cleared the skies for the D-Day invasion, and carried the air war to the very heart of Germany. From the fields of England to the skies over Berlin, the Mustang and its pilots had been the decisive factor in the air war. They had flown until the very end, completing their final missions with the same professionalism and courage they had shown throughout the conflict. The war they helped win was over, but the legend of the P-51 Mustang and the brave pilots who flew it had only just begun. When the roar of World War II finally faded, you might think the story of the P-51 Mustang would fade with it, but for this legendary warbird, the end of the war was just the beginning of a new chapter. The Mustang wasn't ready to be a museum piece just yet. Its incredible performance meant it was one of the few propeller-driven fighters to see action in the jet age, flying into the crucible of the Korean War. Imagine the scene over the Korean peninsula. Sleek, new jet fighters like the MiG-15 are streaking across the sky, and right there, holding its own, is the P-51 Mustang. Redesignated as the F-51, these piston-engined warriors were called back into service, primarily for ground attack missions. Their long range and ability to carry a heavy payload of bombs and rockets made them perfect for supporting troops on the ground. They could loiter over the battlefield, providing crucial air support that the early fuel-thirsty jets just couldn't match. The 51 pilots flew dangerous missions, diving low to strike enemy supply lines, troop concentrations, and artillery positions. It was a different kind of war than the high-altitude dogfights over Europe, but it was just as vital. These Mustang pilots faced intense anti-aircraft fire, and their bravery was nothing short of heroic. They proved that even in the dawn of the jet age, a well-designed, reliable aircraft could still be a decisive weapon. The Mustang's service in Korea was a testament to its incredible versatility and robust design, a bridge between two distinct eras of aerial warfare. Beyond the battlefield, the Mustang found a new life and a new kind of fame. Air racing. Stripped of their military hardware and armor, these planes were purebred speed machines. Visionary pilots and mechanics saw the raw potential locked within the Mustang S airframe and its powerful Merlin engine. They began to modify and tune them, pushing the boundaries of what a piston-engine aircraft could do. The Cleveland National Air Races, and later the Renault Air Races, became the ultimate proving ground. Names like Anson Johnson, who flew a P-51 named Beijing to victory in the 1948 Thompson Trophy race, became legends. He set a new speed record, averaging over 400 miles per hour. This was a jaw-dropping speed for a propeller plane. Another famous racing Mustang was Galloping Ghost, a highly modified P-51 that dominated the races for years, constantly being tweaked and refined to squeeze out every last bit of performance. These races were more than just a sport. They were a showcase of engineering genius. The Mustang's sleek, laminar flow wing and powerful engine provided the perfect canvas for innovation. Mechanics and pilots became artists, sculpting and refining their machines into record-breaking. The sight and sound of these souped-up Mustangs tearing around the pylons at treetop level captured the public's imagination. It cemented the P-51's reputation not just as a weapon of war, but as an icon of pure, unadulterated speed and power. The Mustang's legacy wasn't just written in combat records or racing trophies. It was etched into the hearts and minds of a generation. For the pilots who flew it, the Mustang was more than just a machine. It was a partner, a protector, an extension of their own will. They spoke of its responsiveness, its grace in the sky, and the feeling of confidence it inspired. To sit in the cockpit of a P-51 was to command the finest fighting aircraft of its day. These pilots, men from all walks of life, became the knights of the air. They were the Tuskegee Airmen, breaking racial barriers and proving their skill and courage against the best of the Luftwaffe. They were the farm boys from the Midwest, the city kids from the East Coast, all united by their shared experience in the cockpit of this incredible plane. Their stories, their sacrifices, and their victories are inextricably linked to the legacy of the Mustang. For them, it was the Cadillac of the skies, a plane that would always get them home, and that inspiration spread far beyond the pilots themselves. For the ground crews who worked tirelessly to keep the Mustangs flying, the plane was a source of immense pride. They knew that every bolt they tightened, every engine they tuned, was a vital part of the war effort. They saw the bullet holes in the returning planes and worked through the night to patch them up, ready for the next day's mission. Their dedication was the unseen foundation upon which the Mustang's success was built. Even today, the Mustang's influence is everywhere. You can see it in modern aircraft design. The principles of its laminar flow wing, which reduce drag and increase speed and efficiency, are still being studied and applied. The bubble canopy, giving pilots unparalleled all-around vision, became a standard feature on fighter jets for decades to come. The P-51 was a masterpiece of aerodynamic and engineering innovation, a benchmark that designers would strive to meet for years. But its legacy goes deeper. The Mustang represents a turning point in the history of air power. It was the plane that finally allowed the Allies to establish total air superiority over Europe. Its long range meant it could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, protecting them from enemy fighters and crippling the German war machine. Without the Mustang, the strategic bombing campaign might have failed, and the course of the war could have been very different. It truly was the aircraft that won the skies of World War II. Today, the roar of a Merlin engine still turns every head at an air. The sight of a polished P-51 banking gracefully against a blue sky is breathtaking. These flying memorials are lovingly maintained by dedicated owners and organizations, ensuring that future generations can witness this piece of history firsthand. They serve as a powerful reminder of the ingenuity, courage, and sacrifice of a generation. When you look at a P-51 Mustang, you're not just looking at an old airplane. You're looking at the embodiment of Allied innovation. You're seeing the result of a desperate race against time to build a fighter that could turn the tide of the war. You're seeing a symbol of freedom, a testament to the skill of the pilots who flew it and the dedication of the crews who maintained it. It's a perfect balance of grace and power, a design that remains timeless. The P-51 Mustang wasn't just a plane. It was a legend forged in the heat of combat, refined on the racecourse, and immortalized in the annals of aviation history. It was the turning point, the game changer, the aircraft that secured the skies and helped secure victory. Its legacy is a powerful story of human achievement that continues to inspire us all.